I was mowing my backyard on a Saturday morning when I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Smoke was curling from a chimney that, to my knowledge, should not exist. The white wisps rose steadily from what appeared to be a miniature cottage nestled under my oak trees, complete with a tiny brick chimney that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. A child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, was sitting on a small porch attached to the structure, swinging her legs and eating what looked like a popsicle. She waved at me cheerfully, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Just last month, there had been nothing but grass and the shade of my century-old oak trees in that corner of my property. I set down my mower and walked closer, my work boots crushing the freshly cut grass. The cottage was real, all right. Pastel blue paint covered the exterior walls, and there were actual curtains in the windows. A small welcome mat sat at the front door, and potted begonias lined the miniature porch railing. As I walked along my fence line, trying to understand what I was looking at, I discovered this wasn't an isolated incident. There were 5 of them. 5 quaint, perfectly constructed cottages scattered throughout what used to be the back portion of my property. Each one was painted a different pastel color, like a row of Easter eggs that had somehow sprouted foundations and roofs. They had mailboxes, actual functioning mailboxes with numbers on them. Garden paths made of stepping stones connected each cottage to a main walkway that hadn't existed when I left for my business trip 3 weeks ago. The most shocking detail was the signs. Professional, glossy signs that read Airbnb Superhost Property were staked into the ground next to each cottage. My jaw dropped as I noticed extension cords running from my outdoor outlets to each structure, and what appeared to be water hoses connected to my irrigation system. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed 911. This had to be some kind of mistake, or maybe I was having a very vivid hallucination brought on by too much sun exposure. But the dispatcher who answered was very real, and so was the patrol car that arrived 20 minutes later. The officers seemed just as confused as I was. Officer Martinez walked the perimeter with me while his partner, Officer Chen, took photographs. We were examining the 3rd cottage, a mint green structure with window boxes full of petunias, when a golf cart came careening around the corner of my house. The woman driving it was exactly what you'd expect from someone who owns a golf cart with their name embroidered on the seat cushions. She wore a sun visor with rhinestones spelling out President, a pearl necklace that looked heavy enough to anchor a small boat, and a pink polo shirt with our HOA logo embroidered on the pocket. This was Charlene Dribbs, and she was carrying a tray of iced tea glasses like she was hosting a garden party. She said with a syrupy, sweet voice that made my teeth hurt, "Officers, how wonderful to see Pine Valley's finest out here on such a beautiful day. Can I offer you some fresh squeezed lemonade? Or perhaps some sweet tea? I just made it this morning with mint from my garden." Officer Martinez looked at her with professional skepticism and said, "Ma'am, we're responding to a trespassing complaint. Are you aware of any unauthorized construction on this property?" Charlene's laugh tinkled like broken glass and she said, "Unauthorized? Oh my goodness, there must be some confusion. Everything here is perfectly legal and above board. I have all the documentation right here in my folder." She produced a manila folder thick enough to use as a doorstop, pulling out papers with official-looking headers and stamps. She waved them around like a magician showing off cards before a trick. I pointed at the cottages and said with barely contained frustration, "That's my land. Those structures are on my property. I never gave permission for any of this." Charlene's expression shifted from sweet to sharp in an instant, like a candy apple with a razor blade inside. She said with a tone that could freeze antifreeze, "No, Mr. Travers, it's been reassigned. The property lines were redrawn according to the Neighborhood Covenant subsection 12.3.5, which clearly states that unused land can be repurposed for community benefit after a unanimous HOA board vote." I felt my blood pressure rising and said, "What vote? I was never notified of any vote, and that's not even legally possible. You can't just redraw property lines." She adjusted her visor and smiled that practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes, then said, "All homeowners were notified via the community newsletter. It's not my fault if you don't read the important communications from your HOA. And as for the legality, well, you'll be hearing from my lawyer about this harassment. Officers, I believe Mr. Travers is creating a hostile environment for our vacation rental guests. There are families with children staying in these cottages." Officer Chen stepped forward and said in a calm but firm voice, "Ma'am, We're going to need to see proper documentation showing ownership of this land and building permits for these structures." Charlene's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered and said, "Of course, officer. Everything is filed with the city. I'll have my assistant send over copies first thing Monday morning. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to check on our guests." The family in Sunrise Nook requested extra towels. She climbed back into her golf cart and drove away, leaving a cloud of freshly kicked-up grass clippings in her wake. The officers told me they'd file a report and suggested I contact a lawyer immediately. As they left, I stood in my backyard staring at the cottages that had somehow materialized while I was gone, wondering how my quiet life had suddenly turned into a battlefield. I'm Dale Travers, and up until this moment I thought I lived a pretty normal life. I work as a systems engineer for a tech company that develops security software for banks. It's the kind of job where I spend most of my time looking at code and attending virtual meetings with people whose faces I only know through webcam rectangles. I bought my ranch-style home in Pine Valley Estates 5 years ago specifically because I wanted to escape the chaos of downtown living. The commute was longer, sure, but the peace and quiet were worth it. The house itself wasn't anything special when I bought it. Just a 1970s ranch with good bones and a huge backyard that backed up to a small wooded area. I'd spent years slowly fixing it up, replacing windows, updating the kitchen, and creating my own little paradise. The backyard was my sanctuary. I had bird feeders stationed throughout the property, each one carefully placed to attract different species. I'd identified 47 different types of birds that visited regularly, and I kept a journal documenting their patterns. I'm what you might call pathologically polite. I hold doors open for people even when they're still 20 feet away, creating that awkward situation where they have to do that little half jog to not keep me waiting. I apologize when other people bump into me. I write thank you cards for thank you cards. My idea of confrontation is leaving a slightly passive-aggressive note about recycling bins being left out too long, and even then I feel guilty about it for weeks. My hobbies, besides birdwatching, include making elaborate charcuterie boards that I photograph, but rarely eat entirely, building model trains that I display in my basement, and reading mystery novels where the biggest plot twist is usually who stole the church fundraiser money. I'm 38 years old, single by choice after a relationship that ended when my ex said I was too predictable, and perfectly content with my quiet routine. I paid my HOA dues on time every single month, setting up automatic payments so I wouldn't even have to think about it. I kept my lawn at the regulation 2.5 inches height, my hedges trimmed to the approved specifications, and my mailbox painted in one of the 3 approved colors, which in my case was Charleston green. I waved at neighbors during my evening walks, remembered to bring my trash cans in within 4 hours of pickup, and even participated in the annual neighborhood garage sale, though I mostly just sold old electronics and duplicate kitchen gadgets. But I never attended HOA meetings. That was my fatal flaw, apparently. The meetings were held on the 3rd Tuesday of every month at 7 p.m. in the community center, which was really just a converted house near the entrance of our subdivision. I'd gone to one meeting when I first moved in, spent 2 hours listening to a heated debate about whether brass or brushed nickel house numbers were more aesthetically pleasing, and decided my time was better spent doing literally anything else. That's when I first appeared on Charlene Dribbs's radar, though I didn't know it at the time. Charlene had been HOA president for 14 years, which in HOA terms is basically a lifetime appointment. She ran unopposed every election because nobody else wanted the job. Or more accurately, nobody wanted to deal with what would happen if they tried to challenge her. She ruled over Pine Valley Estates with the energy of a cruise director who believed democracy was a mistake that needed to be corrected through strict enforcement of increasingly specific rules. Under her leadership, our HOA handbook had grown from a reasonable 20 pages to a tome of 347 pages, with subsections covering everything from the acceptable angle of basketball hoops to the maximum number of garden gnomes per square foot of yard space. Charlene had rules about mailbox fonts. Not just the numbers, but the font of the numbers. She conducted monthly inspections where she'd measure the height of grass with an actual ruler, photograph any violations, and issue warnings with the efficiency of a parking enforcement officer who'd just had their coffee insulted. She owned that golf cart with her name embroidered on the seat, but she also had a backup golf cart for when the first one was being serviced, and yes, that one also had her name on it. Her house was the unofficial HOA headquarters, despite the existence of the actual community center. She'd converted her garage into an office space with filing cabinets containing records on every household in the neighborhood. She knew who'd been late on dues in 2018, who'd planted roses in unapproved colors, and who'd dared to put up holiday decorations 2 days before the approved decoration period began. But what really bothered Charlene wasn't rule violations. Those she could handle with fines and strongly worded letters on official HOA letterhead. What really got under her skin were homeowners who weren't active in the community. In her mind, not attending meetings was worse than having brown patches in your lawn. At least the person with the brown lawn was trying and failing. The person who didn't attend meetings wasn't even trying. She'd created a mental categorization system for all 212 households in Pine Valley Estates. There were the active participants who attended every meeting and volunteered for committees. There were the occasional supporters who showed up for important votes and annual picnics. There were the passive compliers who followed rules but didn't engage. And then there was the category she'd created specifically for people like me, which she called deliberate non-participants. In Charlene's worldview, deliberate non-participants were a threat to the very fabric of the community. We paid our dues and followed the rules just enough to avoid fines, but we didn't buy into the spirit of Pine Valley Estates. We were outsiders living inside, wolves in sheep's clothing, or in my case a quiet engineer in a polo shirt and khakis, who just wanted to watch birds and be left alone. I became her special project about 2 years ago. Though I didn't realize it at the time, it started with friendly reminders slipped under my door about upcoming meetings, with handwritten notes saying things like, "Would love to see you there and your input would be valuable." When those didn't work, the tone shifted. The notes became formal letters about the importance of civic engagement and community responsibility. She'd stop by occasionally, always with some pretense. She needed to inspect the storm drains that happened to be near my property. She was checking on the health of the oak trees that technically belonged to my lot, but whose branches extended over the sidewalk. She was conducting a survey about resident satisfaction, and mine was the only response still missing. Each time she'd mention the upcoming meeting, and each time I'd politely decline, citing work obligations or previous commitments. What I didn't understand was that in Charlene's mind, every polite decline was a personal insult. Every missed meeting was a declaration of war. Every time I failed to volunteer for the Spring Beautification Committee or the Holiday Decoration Task Force, I was essentially spitting in the face of everything she'd built. I thought I was being a good neighbor by staying out of the way. She thought I was being a bad citizen by not falling in line. The first real shot fired in what would become our war was a letter about my bird feeders. Not that I had them, but that they were the wrong type. According to subsection 43.8 of the HOA handbook, which had apparently been updated, I was blissfully unaware. Bird feeders needed to be either natural wood or black metal. Mine were dark green plastic, which I'd chosen specifically because they blended in with the foliage. I replaced them, because it wasn't worth the fight. But then came the letter about my wind chimes. They were improperly enthusiastic according to the violation notice. I didn't even know enthusiasm could be improper, much less how to measure it in wind chimes. The notice explained that the chimes created excessive and distinctive noise that disrupted the acoustic harmony of the neighborhood. They were bamboo chimes that made soft, hollow sounds when the breeze hit them, barely audible from 10 feet away. Next came the complaint about my charcuterie boards. Not the boards themselves, but the fact that I photographed them on my back deck, which Charlene claimed constituted commercial activity in a residential zone because I posted the photos on Instagram. When I pointed out that I didn't sell anything or make money from the photos, she countered that the potential for monetization exists, which violated the spirit if not the letter of the regulations. Then came my favorite accusation, that my bird feeders were attracting morally questionable fauna. When I asked for clarification, hoping maybe she'd finally lost it enough that I could get her removed, she provided a 2-page document explaining that blue jays were known to be aggressive to other birds, and by feeding them I was encouraging antisocial bird behavior that could lead to a breakdown in the natural order of the neighborhood ecosystem. She'd actually cited scientific journals, though she'd misinterpreted most of them. Each time I complied, fixed whatever absurd violation she'd found, and went about my life. I thought I was taking the high road, being the bigger person, avoiding conflict like the pathologically polite person I was. What I didn't realize was that compliance without participation was, in Charlene's mind, the worst kind of insult. I was following her rules without acknowledging her authority, obeying the letter of the law while ignoring the spirit of her reign. The situation escalated when I started traveling more for work. My company had landed a major contract with a bank chain on the West Coast, and I was flying to Seattle every few weeks for implementation meetings. These trips usually lasted 3 to 5 days, sometimes stretching to a week if there were complications. I'd arrange for a neighbor kid to mow my lawn and water my plants, making sure everything stayed within HOA compliance even in my absence. It was during one of these trips, a 2-week stint in Seattle for a critical system upgrade, that Charlene made her move. I'd left on a Monday morning, catching a 6 a.m. flight, blissfully unaware that my absence would be seen as an opportunity. In Charlene's mind, I'd abandoned my property, left it unattended and unloved, and that meant it was fair game for improvement. She started implementing her plan the day after I left. First, she called an emergency HOA board meeting for that Tuesday night, knowing I wouldn't be there to object. The other 4 board members, all of whom were either afraid of Charlene or had been worn down by years of her relentless personality, didn't question why this particular meeting needed to be held with only 24 hours' notice. The agenda for that meeting contained a single item: beautification and utilization of unused community-adjacent spaces. In Charlene's interpretation, the back portion of my property, which I'd left natural with just grass and trees, qualified as unused space that was adjacent to the community because it backed up to the walking path that wound through the neighborhood. She presented a 30-slide PowerPoint presentation about the benefits of micro-communities and vacation rental opportunities that could enhance property values and bring diverse perspectives to Pine Valley estates. She showed pictures of tiny houses from Pinterest, revenue projections that she'd completely made up but presented with the confidence of a Fortune 500 CEO, and a map of my property with 5 small circles drawn in the back section. The vote was unanimous, because of course it was. The meeting minutes, which I'd later obtained through my lawyer, showed that the entire discussion lasted 12 minutes. Motion proposed by Charlene Dribbs, seconded by Tom Harrison, who'd later tell me he thought they were just approving a conceptual plan for future discussion. Vote 5-0 in favor. Meeting adjourned. By Wednesday morning, Charlene had a crew at my house, not a legitimate construction crew with permits and licenses, but her nephew's landscaping company that usually just did lawn maintenance and minor repairs. They started by marking off the back section of my property with stakes and string, creating 5 small plots that Charlene had designated for the cottages. The structures themselves weren't built from scratch, which is how they appeared so quickly. Charlene had purchased 5 prefabricated luxury sheds from a company that specialized in backyard offices and mother-in-law suites. These were essentially glorified sheds with insulation, windows, and basic electrical wiring, designed to be assembled quickly and without the need for traditional foundations. Each one cost about $8,000, which Charlene paid for using HOA emergency maintenance funds that were supposed to be reserved for things like storm damage repair or unexpected infrastructure failures. In the paperwork, she listed the expense as Community Enhancement Project Alpha, which sounded official enough that the HOA treasurer, who was 73 and trusted Charlene implicitly, signed off on it without question. The installation process was a master class in skirting regulations. The structures were technically temporary because they sat on concrete blocks rather than permanent foundations, which meant they didn't require the same building permits as traditional construction. The electrical connections were run through heavy-duty extension cords from my outdoor outlets, which Charlene classified as temporary power solutions, even though she had no intention of them being temporary. The water situation was even more creative. Rather than installing proper plumbing, which would have required permits and inspections, she had the crew tap into my irrigation system with a series of hoses and splitters. Each cottage got a garden hose running to it, hidden under mulch and decorative stones. The cottages didn't have bathrooms, which would have been a dead giveaway that this was illegal, but Charlene planned to market them as glamping experiences, where guests would use the community facilities, which meant porta potties she'd rent and place strategically behind decorative fencing. By Thursday, the structures were in place. Friday was spent on decoration and furnishing. Charlene recruited her book club, her church group, and the Pine Valley Estates Women's Auxiliary to help with the interior decoration. They descended on the cottages like a swarm of Martha Stewart disciples, armed with throw pillows, mason jar lights, and enough burlap and shiplap to outfit a dozen farmhouse renovation shows. Each cottage was given a theme. The Magnolia Whimsy was decorated in Southern charm style with white furniture and magnolia prints. Sunrise Nook got a beachy theme with seashell decorations and ocean blue accents. Birch bungalow went full rustic with plaid blankets and antler wall hooks. Serenity's sprout was all about zen, with bamboo screens and a small meditation corner. And Kevin's den, named after Charlene's ancient Persian cat, was decorated in what can only be described as aggressive cat lady chic, with cat-themed everything from the doormat to the ceiling fan poles. While the decorating was happening, Charlene was busy creating the online listings. She took professional quality photos using her nephew's girlfriend, who fancied herself an influencer and had a good camera. The listings described the cottages as unique glamping experiences in the heart of Pine Valley Estates, and featured copy that would make a real estate agent blush. Escape to your own private retreat. Experience the charm of tiny living. All the amenities of home in a cozy, curated space. She priced them at $120 a night, which was ambitious for glorified sheds without bathrooms, but she marketed them as exclusive and limited availability, creating false scarcity by blocking out random dates as already booked. She also required a 2-night minimum stay and a $100 cleaning fee, because even in her criminal enterprise, Charlene couldn't resist fee inflation. By the weekend, while I was in Seattle dealing with server migrations and security protocols, the cottages were not only complete, but had their first guests. A family from Ohio had booked Sunrise Nook for a long weekend. A couple celebrating their anniversary was in Magnolia Whimsy. The others were still empty but had bookings coming up for the following week. Charlene handled the guest communications through her personal email, sending elaborate welcome messages with house rules that included quiet hours, parking instructions, and a note about respecting the primary residence on the property, which was my house. She even created a little welcome basket for each cottage with local honey, homemade cookies, and a printed guide to area attractions that she'd had spiral-bound at the local print shop. The money started flowing immediately. That first weekend brought in almost $800 after all the fees. Charlene opened a separate bank account under the HOA's name but with only her signature authority, calling it the Community Enhancement Fund. She justified this to herself and anyone who asked as investment in the neighborhood's future, though she was already eyeing a new golf cart with better suspension and a built-in cooler. The whole operation ran smoothly for nearly 2 weeks. Guests came and went, leaving positive reviews about the quirky and charming accommodations. One reviewer mentioned the authentic suburban experience and praised the attention to detail in the decor. Another noted that while the bathroom situation was unusual, the hosts were accommodating and communicative. Charlene was riding high on her success. She'd proven, at least to herself, that my unused land was better served as a revenue generator for the community. She'd shown initiative and business acumen. She'd created something from nothing, or rather from something that belonged to someone else. In her mind, she was a visionary entrepreneur who'd found a way to monetize lazy homeowners' wasted space. She even started planning Phase 2, which would involve similar projects on other properties with large yards. She had her eye on the Henderson's side yard and the empty lot where the Johnsons had torn down an old shed. She created a presentation for the next HOA meeting about expanding the Community Enhancement Project and projected annual revenues that would eliminate the need for HOA dues entirely. Meanwhile, I was completely oblivious to all of this. I was dealing with my own challenges in Seattle, working 16-hour days to resolve critical security vulnerabilities that had been discovered during the implementation. I was living on hotel coffee and conference room sandwiches, falling into bed each night too exhausted to do more than set my alarm for the next morning's crisis. The neighbor kid I'd hired to mow my lawn, 16-year-old Marcus from 3 houses down, had noticed the construction but assumed I'd authorized it. He mowed around the cottages, careful not to disturb the new stepping stone paths or the decorative plants Charlene had added. He'd even texted me a photo of my freshly cut lawn, but the angle didn't show the cottages, and I'd simply replied with a thumbs up and a Venmo payment. It wasn't until my project wrapped up early and I caught a Thursday night red-eye flight home instead of waiting for my scheduled Saturday departure that I discovered what had happened. I'd wanted to surprise myself with an extra day of relaxation. Maybe spend Friday afternoon on my deck with a book and a beer, watching the birds and enjoying the quiet of my backyard sanctuary. Instead, I found my sanctuary transformed into Charlene's personal Airbnb empire, complete with guests, smoke rising from decorative chimneys that were really just essential oil diffusers designed to look like they were producing real smoke, and children playing in what used to be my private space. The quiet afternoon I'd imagined evaporated like morning mist in the harsh light of Charlene's audacity. The confrontation that followed, with the police and Charlene's arrival in her golf cart, was just the beginning. As Officer Martinez had suggested, I immediately contacted a lawyer, not just any lawyer but Patricia Steinberg, a property attorney who'd made a name for herself dealing with HOA overreach cases. She actually laughed when I told her the story, not because she didn't believe me, but because she'd been waiting for someone to finally give her a case against Charlene Dribbs. It turned out Charlene had a reputation in local legal circles. Patricia's firm had a betting pool on when she'd finally crossed the line from annoying to actionable, building illegal structures on someone else's property while they were out of town and then renting them out for profit. That wasn't just crossing the line, that was pole vaulting over it while setting it on fire. The first thing Patricia did was file for an emergency injunction to stop any further rentals. We couldn't kick out the current guests as they were innocent parties who'd paid for accommodations in good faith, but we could prevent new bookings. The judge granted it immediately, barely able to hide his amazement at the situation. Next came the formal demand letter to Charlene and the HOA board. Patricia crafted a masterpiece of legal writing that managed to be both professionally courteous and absolutely devastating. It outlined the various laws Charlene had broken, from trespassing to fraud to theft of utilities, and demanded immediate cessation of all activities, removal of the structures, and compensation for damages. Charlene's response was to double down. She hired her own lawyer, Bradley Thornton, who was actually her cousin's husband, and primarily practiced family law, but had agreed to take the case because Charlene had threatened to make his life miserable if he didn't. He filed a countersuit claiming that I had abandoned my property, that the HOA had the right to utilize unused land for community benefit, and that I was now harassing Charlene and causing emotional distress. The emotional distress claim was particularly rich, considering I was the one who'd come home to find my backyard converted into a tiny house village. But Charlene had started documenting everything as if she was the victim. She took photos of herself looking sad while standing near the cottages. She had her friends write affidavits about how upset she was by my aggressive response to her community improvement initiative. She also began a campaign to turn the neighborhood against me. She held informal meetings in her living room where she painted me as an absent homeowner who didn't care about the community and was now trying to destroy a project that brought joy to visiting families. She created a Facebook group called Save the Pine Valley Cottages and posted photos of happy children playing in the cottage yards, couples enjoying morning coffee on the tiny porches, and sunset views through the oak trees. The narrative she spun was impressive in its audacity. According to Charlene, she'd invested her own money and time into improving abandoned land that was bringing down property values. She claimed the cottages were a pilot program for a larger community initiative that would put Pine Valley Estates on the map as a forward-thinking, innovative neighborhood. She even suggested that I was only objecting because I hadn't thought of it first. But while Charlene was waging her propaganda war, Patricia was building our legal case with the thoroughness of a forensic accountant. She pulled property records going back 50 years, confirming beyond any doubt that the land belonged to me. She obtained the HOA meeting minutes through a formal records request, showing the rushed vote with no proper notice. She documented the illegal utility connections with photos and utility company records. The smoking gun came when Patricia subpoenaed the HOA financial records. Not only had Charlene used HOA funds without proper authorization, but she'd also been depositing the Airbnb revenue into that separate account she controlled. The paper trail showed she'd already collected over $12,000 in just 3 weeks, none of which had been reported to the HOA board or the IRS. Things escalated when the local news got wind of the story. A reporter from Channel 7 had been tipped off by someone in Patricia's office, and they showed up at my house with a camera crew. I declined to comment on advice from my lawyer, but Charlene couldn't resist the spotlight. She gave an interview in front of the cottages, wearing her best pearl necklace and her president visor, explaining how she was trying to innovate and improve the community. The interview didn't go the way she planned. The reporter asked hard questions about property rights and legal permits. When Charlene tried to deflect, claiming everything was approved by the HOA board, the reporter had already interviewed Tom Harrison, who went on camera to say he thought they were just approving a conceptual plan, not actual construction on someone's private property. The story aired that night with the title, HOA President's Tiny Big Problem, and it was not flattering to Charlene. They included shots of the illegal electrical connections, the garden hoses running water to the cottages, and a particularly damning clip where Charlene said, "Sometimes you have to break a few rules to make an omelet," before realizing she'd mixed her metaphors and trying to correct herself while the camera was still rolling. The next day, city code enforcement showed up. They didn't need a warrant because the violations were visible from the street. The inspector, a no-nonsense woman named Deborah Martinez, took one look at the setup and started writing citations. Each cottage was a separate violation. The electrical connections were 5 more violations. The water connections added another 5. The lack of permits, the absence of proper inspections, the failure to comply with setback requirements. The list went on. By the time Inspector Martinez was done, she'd written 23 separate citations, each carrying fines between $500 and $5,000. The total potential fines exceeded $60,000, and that was just from the city. The county showed up the next day with their own inspector and their own set of violations. Charlene tried to charm her way out of it, offering Inspector Martinez tea and cookies, explaining her vision for community enhancement. Martinez responded by adding another citation for operating commercial rentals in a residential zone without a business license. When Charlene protested that she was just trying to help the community, Martinez pointed out that helping the community didn't exempt anyone from following building codes and zoning laws. The health department got involved when they learned about the bathroom situation. The porta potties Charlene had rented were not permitted for use as primary facilities for rental properties. The fire department added their own citations for the improper electrical setup, creating fire hazards. Even the State Department of Revenue sent a letter inquiring about the unreported rental income. While the bureaucratic hammer was falling, the Airbnb situation was becoming its own disaster. The platform had received complaints about the listings, particularly after the news story aired. They suspended all 5 listings pending investigation and froze the payments for future bookings. The current guests were offered refunds and alternative accommodations, which Airbnb would later seek to recover from Charlene. One guest, a lawyer from Chicago who'd booked Birch Bungalow for a wedding weekend, realized the legal situation and sent Charlene a demand letter of his own, seeking damages for fraudulent misrepresentation. He'd paid for a legal vacation rental, and instead found himself in the middle of a property dispute that had made the local news. He wanted a full refund, plus compensation for the alternative hotel he had to book, plus punitive damages for the embarrassment. The HOA board finally grew a spine when they realized the legal liability they were facing. They called an emergency meeting, this time with proper notice, and the community center was packed. Homeowners who hadn't attended a meeting in years showed up to witness what everyone was calling Charlene's last stand. Patricia attended the meeting with me, which was unusual for HOA meetings but necessary given the circumstances. She presented a clear summary of the legal situation, including the potential liability for every homeowner if the HOA was found complicit in Charlene's actions. The number she put on screen representing potential damages, fines, and legal costs was $700,000. The room gasped. These were people who complained about $20 increases in monthly dues. The thought of a special assessment to cover Charlene's cottage adventure sent them into a panic. The calls for Charlene's resignation started immediately, growing from murmurs to shouts. Charlene tried to maintain control, banging her gavel and calling for order, but the revolution had begun. Tom Harrison made a motion to remove Charlene as president, effective immediately. It was seconded by 4 different people simultaneously. When Charlene tried to rule the motion out of order, claiming it wasn't on the agenda, Patricia pointed out that according to the HOA's own bylaws, any motion regarding board positions could be raised during emergency meetings if it pertained to the emergency at hand. The vote was called. It wasn't even close. 173 votes for removal, 2 against. The 2 against were Charlene herself, who insisted she had the right to vote, and her friend Margaret, who later claimed she'd misunderstood and thought she was voting to remove the cottages, not Charlene. But Charlene wasn't done. Even as the vote was being counted, she was on her phone with Bradley Thornton, trying to find some legal maneuver to stop what was happening. She claimed the vote was invalid because not all homeowners were present. She argued that the cottages were a separate issue from her presidency. She even tried to claim that removing her would cause irreparable harm to the community because no one else knew how to run the HOA. That last claim might have held some weight if she hadn't spent the last 14 years deliberately making herself indispensable by keeping all the important information in her head or in her personal files. But the board had already thought of that. They'd hired a management company to take over operations temporarily, and they'd already begun transferring files and access to accounts. The meeting continued past 11 p.m. with motion after motion to undo Charlene's recent actions. They voted to return all HOA funds used for the cottages. They voted to cooperate fully with all investigations. They voted to formally apologize to me and cover my legal costs. They even voted to reduce the HOA handbook back to its original 20 pages, eliminating hundreds of Charlene's petty rules in one sweeping motion. Charlene stood at the podium throughout it all, gripping the edges like she was on a ship in a storm. Her face cycled through emotions like a slot machine: anger, disbelief, indignation, and occasionally brief flashes of what might have been recognition that she'd gone too far. But those moments were quickly replaced by defiance. When the meeting finally ended, she had to be escorted out by the same security guard she'd hired to keep non-residents out of HOA meetings. The irony was lost on no one. As she left, she shouted that we'd all regret this, that the neighborhood would fall apart without her leadership, and that she'd see everyone in court. The next morning, a Saturday, I woke to find a crew dismantling the cottages. The new HOA board had hired a professional company to remove them properly, ensuring no damage to my property. It was almost surreal watching them come down as quickly as they'd gone up, like a time-lapse video in reverse. Charlene, meanwhile, had barricaded herself in her house and was posting increasingly unhinged messages on the Pine Valley Estates Facebook page, which she still had admin access to. She compared herself to various historical figures who'd been persecuted for their vision. She posted photos of the cottages with captions like "They destroyed beauty today, and this is what happens when mediocrity wins." The posts got wilder as the day went on. She claimed I was part of a conspiracy to take over the HOA. She suggested the new board members were being paid off by rival neighborhoods. She even implied that the city inspectors were corrupt and she was going to expose them all. Finally, Tom Harrison, who'd figured out how to remove her admin access, cut her off from the page. Cut off from her digital pulpit, Charlene resorted to physical letters. Every homeowner received a 5-page single-spaced manifesto explaining her side of the story. It was a masterpiece of delusion, painting her as a visionary leader brought down by small-minded bureaucrats and jealous neighbors. She included financial projections, showing how the cottage program would have made everyone rich, charts and graphs she'd clearly made in Microsoft Paint, and a section titled "What You've Lost" that listed benefits like increased property values, cultural diversity, and somehow improved air quality. Patricia advised me to keep the letter as evidence, but otherwise ignore it. The legal case was proceeding, and Charlene's manifesto would only help our position by demonstrating her complete disconnect from reality and the law. The civil case moved faster than expected, partly because Charlene kept making it worse for herself. During depositions, she contradicted herself repeatedly. She claimed the cottages were temporary structures one minute and permanent improvements the next. She insisted she had verbal permission from me, while also arguing I'd abandoned the property. She even tried to claim sovereign citizen status at one point, which her own lawyer quickly shut down. Bradley Thornton, to his credit, tried to build a defense around the idea that the HOA board had approved the action, making it a civil dispute between organizations rather than criminal trespass. But when board members testified that they'd been misled about what they were voting on, and when the financial records showed Charlene had personally profited from the rentals, that defense crumbled. The criminal charges were filed 2 months after the cottages came down. The district attorney's office had been reluctant at first, seeing it as a civil matter, but the sheer number of violations and the clear evidence of fraud changed their minds. Charlene was charged with 5 counts of criminal trespass, 5 counts of theft of utilities, 1 count of fraud, and 1 count of embezzlement of HOA funds. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning. I wasn't there, but Margaret, despite being Charlene's friend, couldn't resist telling everyone about it. The police arrived at 7 a.m., which was when Charlene usually did her power walk around the neighborhood. She was in her walking outfit, complete with ankle weights and a visor that said "Moving Forward" in glittery letters. According to Margaret, Charlene tried to negotiate with the officers, explaining that she couldn't be arrested because she had a hair appointment at 9 and a lunch meeting with the garden club at noon. When they insisted she needed to come with them, she demanded to speak to their supervisor, then their supervisor's supervisor, and finally asked if they knew who she was. They did know who she was. That was why they were there. She was released on bail that afternoon, and immediately violated the restraining order that had been put in place by driving her golf cart past my house slowly, staring at where the cottages had been. She didn't stop or say anything, just drove by at about 2 miles per hour, which she apparently thought didn't count as harassment. The security camera footage disagreed, as did the judge, who increased her bail and confiscated the golf cart. The trial was set for 6 months out, but the civil case concluded much sooner. Given the overwhelming evidence, Patricia had pushed for summary judgment, which the judge granted. Charlene was ordered to pay restitution for the cost of removing the cottages, the utilities that had been stolen, the legal fees and punitive damages for trespass. The total came to $180,000. She didn't have it, of course. She'd spent the Airbnb money on new furniture for her house, a vacation to Bermuda that she'd posted extensively about on Instagram, and legal fees for Bradley Thornton, who'd wisely insisted on being paid up front. Her house, which she'd refinanced twice to fund various investment opportunities, had little equity left. The HOA was ordered to pay an additional $50,000 for their role in enabling the trespass, though they were able to recover some of that from their insurance after a long battle with the insurance company. About whether HOA president builds illegal cottages on residents' property was covered under their liability policy. As the criminal trial approached, Charlene's behavior became increasingly erratic. She started a blog called The Truth About Pine Valley Estates, where she posted daily screeds about corruption, conspiracy, and her status as a political prisoner. She compared her prosecution to the Salem witch trials, Watergate, and somehow the French Revolution. She sold T-shirts with her mugshot and the words "visionary, not criminal" printed below it. Nobody bought them. She also tried to run for HOA president again, claiming the previous vote was invalid. When told she was no longer eligible due to the criminal charges, she created her own shadow HOA board and started issuing her own newsletters and violation notices. These had no legal standing, but she'd slip them under doors at night, leading to several more charges for violating the restraining order that now covered the entire neighborhood. Her friend Margaret finally distanced herself after Charlene asked her to lie under oath about seeing me give verbal permission for the cottages. Margaret realized that Charlene would drag anyone down with her and decided to save herself. She testified for the prosecution instead, providing crucial evidence about Charlene's planning and her statements about teaching Dale a lesson about community participation. The criminal trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution presented their case methodically. The property records, the forged documents Charlene had created to make the cottage rentals look legitimate, the financial records showing she'd personally profited, and testimony from board members, neighbors, and city officials. Charlene insisted on testifying in her own defense against Bradley Thornton's advice. She took the stand in a suit that looked like it came from a 1980s law drama, complete with shoulder pads that could take out someone's eye. She'd prepared a 40-minute opening statement that the judge had to repeatedly interrupt to remind her to just answer the questions asked. Her testimony was a disaster. She contradicted evidence, claimed documents were forged when they had her signature, and at one point accused me of using bird surveillance to spy on the neighborhood, which caused several jurors to visibly struggle not to laugh. When the prosecutor asked her directly if she built structures on my property without permission, she responded with a 20-minute explanation of property theory that cited everyone from John Locke to Karl Marx. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge, who'd maintained professional composure throughout the trial despite Charlene's numerous outbursts and attempts to fire her lawyer mid-trial, scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. During those 2 weeks, Charlene launched what she called her appeal to the people. She stood outside the courthouse every day with a sign that said "Justice for Visionaries" and handed out flyers explaining her case to anyone who'd take them. She gave interviews to anyone with a camera, including a confused tourist who thought she was promoting a local theater production. The sentencing hearing arrived on a Thursday morning. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, local press, and what Charlene called her supporters, though it was really just 3 people from her book club who felt obligated to attend. I sat in the back with Patricia, not taking any satisfaction in what was happening but needing to see it through to the end. The judge allowed victim impact statements first. I kept mine brief, explaining how the violation of my property had affected my sense of security and privacy. Tom Harrison spoke about the damage to the HOA's reputation and finances. Even the Airbnb guests who'd been displaced submitted written statements about the inconvenience and embarrassment. Charlene's statement, which she delivered while occasionally referring to note cards, was a 45-minute odyssey through her life story, her vision for Pine Valley Estates, and her belief that she was being persecuted for being ahead of her time. She compared herself to Steve Jobs, Thomas Edison, and at one point Joan of Arc. She claimed that in 50 years there would be statues of her in the neighborhood celebrating her pioneering spirit. The judge listened patiently, occasionally taking notes, though I suspected she was just doodling to stay focused. When Charlene finally finished, the judge took a moment to compose herself before delivering the sentence. She said in a clear, measured tone, "Miss Dribbs, you have been convicted of serious crimes involving violation of property rights, theft, fraud, and embezzlement. Your actions were not visionary or innovative. They were criminal. You showed no respect for your neighbor's property, no regard for the law, and no remorse for your actions." The judge continued, "Your position as HOA president was one of trust, which you violated egregiously. You used community funds for personal gain, you forged documents, and you persisted in your illegal activities even after being caught. Throughout this trial, you have shown no understanding of why your actions were wrong." She then pronounced the sentence. "On the 5 counts of criminal trespass, I sentence you to 6 months per count, to run concurrently. On the 5 counts of theft of utilities, 3 months per count, concurrent. On the count of fraud, 1 year. On the count of embezzlement, 18 months. The sentences will run consecutively for a total of 2 years and 9 months in state prison." The courtroom was silent for a moment. Charlene stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, her note cards scattered on the defendant's table. Then she started to speak, her voice rising from a whisper to a shout. She yelled, "2 years and 9 months? For trying to improve the neighborhood? For having vision? You're sending me to prison for being creative?" The judge banged her gavel and said firmly, "Miss Dribbs, you're being sent to prison for being a criminal. Court is adjourned." As the bailiff moved to take her into custody, Charlene turned to the gallery, looking directly at me, and shouted, "This is your fault, Dale. You and your birds and your stupid quiet life. I hope you're happy. I hope the neighborhood falls apart without me. I hope your property values tank. I hope your birds all fly away." The bailiff led her away, still shouting about property values and community standards, her voice echoing down the courthouse hallway until a door closed and cut her off mid-sentence about the proper height for hedge trimming.